Hi, everyone. We've set up this Being an Engineer podcast as an industry knowledge repository, if you will. We hope it'll be a tool where engineers can learn about and connect with other companies, technologies, people, resources, and opportunities. So make some connections and enjoy the show.
I think the first thing that struck me was a sense of craft that a lot of these, the professionals on the line, the electricians, sheet metal workers, welders, there's a lot of pride in their craft. Just to kind of see that at work, how they went about their business.
Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of the Being an Engineer podcast. We're talking with Arne Lang-Ree today, who holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and a master's degree in product design from Stanford University. Arne has worked within a variety of design areas from toys to sports to premium products and is the founder and CDO of Spanner Product Development, where he and his team develop exquisitely crafted consumer products in the heart of Silicone Valley. Also, this is a special treat for me because Arne was one of the first people to hire me way back in the day after I had just started Pipeline. And that job was one of my first, what I thought of at the time as big contracts. So it's very cool that I get the chance now to interview Arne. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being with me.
Well, thanks, Aaron. Absolute pleasure to be here.
Okay. What made you decide to become an engineer?
Yeah, I don't know if it was ever really a decision. It just was kind of the flow. My dad was a mechanical engineer, so I had a pretty good idea, I think, early on that engineers got to sort of dream stuff up and then make them. As a kid, like a lot of people that end up in this field, anything in the house that broke was mine to tear down. I just fascinated by how everything went together, like what all the parts and pieces were, how did they work, from washing machines to transistor radios. When I was a teenager, I worked in my dad's fabrication shop, just gopher on the assembly line. So, again, just getting a hands-on sense of how things were made, assembled, and all that. So it just kind of felt like a natural flow of things to just go on into engineering school.
I'm curious about your time working in your dad's fab shop. You mentioned Gopher. What were some of the things that you did there, and how do you think they built a foundation for you, or maybe what were some of the most useful things you did to build that foundation?
Yeah, so just quick context, they made food processing machinery. So big machines, lots of stainless steel, the electrical controls, the motors, all that kind of stuff. And you've probably seen one of their machines. They're in every single Burger King on the planet. The machine that flame broils your burger back there. I think the first thing that struck me was a sense of craft that a lot of these, the professionals on the line, the electricians, sheet metal workers, welders, there's a lot of pride in their craft. And that's probably something my dad recognized when he hired them, but just to kind of see that at work, how they went about their business. My job was deburring sheet metal or stripping and putting terminals on the ends of bits of wire, degreasing stuff that was going to go in the machine, just all the stuff nobody else wanted to do. But I think it gave me a very visceral experience with material, to understand how stainless steel, in sheet metal form behaves, say, and what goes into all of that, why it's important to be tidy about things that users may never see. The electrician jumps out. He was very fastidious about routing wires in the control boxes, making sure all the terminals were labeled properly, wires are cut to the correct length. It was a work of art. But there were reasons for doing that. It was sort of eye-opening that way.
So you're in my opinion anyway, a very successful leader of engineering teams at this point. You've had a successful career. Yeah, you're welcome. And I would love to try and kind of reverse engineer how you got there a little bit so that people listening to this can try and adopt the same mindsets, the same behaviors and practices. Do you recall when you were working back in that fab shop, doing the grunt work, for lack of a better term? What was your mindset then? Was it one of feeling put out that you had to do this grunt work, or was it one of this is great? I'm really happy and grateful that I get the opportunity to learn these things.
Yeah, I think much more the latter. I found everything in there fascinating because, my dad would take my brother and I to the shop, when we were growing up. So we were no stranger to it. And to get to finally work there, on the one hand, felt sort of a privilege. There was also a sense of wanting to prove myself, that I'm not just there because I'm the boss's kid and I'm going to be a slacker. I wanted to prove to the guys on the floor that, I was happy doing that work. I could do a good job, and all of that.
Earning your place.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Well, eventually you graduated from the shop, and earlier in your career, you went on to design toys. I wondered, are there any memorable toys that listeners might remember? And maybe what was your favorite one that you designed?
Yeah, I think probably the most memorable that most people go, oh yeah, I had one of those, was the Vortex football. So when I was looking at Odds On, which was the company that they started by with the Koosh ball, and it was launched by I'm another mechanical engineer, by the way. So the Vortex ball, with the tail on it, and you could throw it farther just because it had a tail. It was more aerodynamic. Everybody remembers that toy. So it was super fun to work on that product line because we were always trying to expand. Is the next one going to go even farther? So it has to be more aerodynamic. And how do we do that in a toy? And, the hours of going back and forth between the model shop and to the parking lot and throwing my shoulder out and, was super fun. I got to go on one of the shoots for the Saturday morning commercial when John Elway was their spokesperson.
Oh, wow.
So I'm like right off camera with a box of Vortex balls, like feeding them to Elway so he can huck them down the field. Lots of really fun stuff like that. My favorite, I think, just as a designer, probably not too many people know, but you might know the company Klutz. They have they're more like craft books. They're more like a publisher of activity books and things, but all of their books typically would come with some material that you would then use, to accomplish the craft or whatever it is in that book.
Okay.
And I did a bunch of stuff for them, but my favorite had nothing to do with the book. It was a parachute toy. So the founder there had this notion, and he actually built this first prototype of a ball about the size of a softball or grapefruit with a big parachute stuffed in it and a piece of webbing that you could then, sling it up into the air. But he wanted the parachute to open elegantly right at the top of the arc, and just poof magically at the top every time. But of course, like any other parachute toy, when you're a little kid, you're trying to throw it in the air, the parachute opens on the way up. And it's, frustrating as can be. So he challenged me to come up with a way to do that with, no batteries, no mechanism, just naturally the way the parts came together that would happen. So it was one of those sketchbook aha moments, just realizing that if the ball opens this way, then, as the air flows around the ball, there's low pressure on the sides, and that's going to pull the ball apart. So if we could make the ball fly this way, so I ended up putting an extra piece of leash on there that came around and hooked to the far side, and then the drag on the leash kept the ball together. But as soon as it stalled out and the leash would kind of catch up, it would unhook and the ball could open.
Okay, brilliant.
So it was kind of all of those elements coming together. As I'm sketching away, it just sort of stopped and went, wait a minute, and ran to the garage and prototyped it, and it all worked.
How big of a part in your design process does sketching something out play? I mean, just the act of no CAD, just a pen and a paper, or a pencil and a paper.
I think it's huge. CAD is an amazing tool. And like any tool, I think it has its place. I think early on in that conceptual part of a process is not the place. I think it tends to have us commit to something prematurely, where sketching, whether it's in a logbook or on a whiteboard, it's much more sort of throwaway. You just want to get stuff out of your brain, and so you can sort through it on paper or on the whiteboard or whatever. You're not as committed to what you're putting down, so you can just kind of, move on, scribble it out or just start over or just keep going. In CAD, you have to think about it a little bit. You have to kind of build some underlying layout or skeleton to kind of keep going, and that it's not as throwaway. You don't want to go back and just toss that. So I think getting fluid with sketching, sort of thinking on paper, is a super powerful skill.
How gifted do you think an engineer needs to be with their hand sketching abilities for it to be a really useful activity? I mean, do we need to be 3D artists on paper, or can we get away with, just kind of blocky things, 2D shapes?
Yeah, I think if you're sketching in your own idea log, you never have to actually show that to anybody. So you can just kind of leave your self-consciousness, at the door, if you will, and just go. As long as you get a sense for what you're putting down, that's what's most important. I do think it helps with the fluidity if you're confident in some sketching skills, but super basic. Often we're sketching mechanical concepts in section and 2D elevations anyway. You don't have to get super fluent with 3D, but it does help to be able to kind of do a quick sketch in perspective, So
Yeah.
buy a sketchbook that, there's plenty out there in the market, like spend time practicing drawing cubes and cylinders and whatnot with a little bit of perspective. It can help a lot, because you do sometimes need to get to that point where you're communicating your ideas to others and you're trying to generate, a kind of collaboration. So it helps to be able to communicate clearly in sketch mode as well. But I think that comes second.
Yeah, that's probably an underappreciated skill that a lot of us should spend some time developing. I don't think I ever had a class like that in college, but that would have been a really useful one. Just basic principles of perspective and 3D sketching. Yeah. I've got a question for you that this is from me as a business owner. I'm curious what your thought is on this kind of a completely different subject here. Working with junior engineers who are, relatively inexpensive to employ, but they lack experience, and senior engineers who are super productive, but also very expensive to employ. Do you have kind of like a rule of thumb or best practice for how many of each group should be part of a given team?
Yeah, I think as an engineer, my answer is it depends.
Of course.
That's a kind of a common conundrum. I don't think there's any right answer. I think there's a right fit for any particular organization. For instance, at Spanner, we're a consulting firm. We're in Silicon Valley. Our rates are pretty high. We know that. So our team is intentionally built around a much more senior staff. We have a couple dozen engineers, designers, and they average 20 plus years of experience. At that size, it's tough to make economic sense out of having somebody on staff who's not as efficient with their hours, and also takes some time away from senior staff who are in the mentorship role and kind of showing them the ropes and all that kind of stuff. you can make up for some of that in the economics of the rates that we charge, but a deadline's a deadline, and the work's got to get done. And, so it tends to create more overhead than it's worth. But in larger organizations, say as Spanners now, we're growing. I think having more headroom gives us a space to bring in younger engineers, because there's advantage there as well, and not just the economic advantage of lower rate and whatnot. Designers, engineers that are more fresh out of school, out of a certain, curriculum, they're going to bring fresh ideas, fresh perspectives, tools that they've learned along the way. And that's, it's competitive advantage, or at least it's kind of keeping up with what's happening in the world in that sense. And then there's just the larger, kind of paying it forward, because we all had mentors, we all had people who spent time helping correct our mistakes and,
For sure.
showing us the way. So, we love to be in that role as well. So we currently have 3 folks kind of at that level.
Okay.
Hopefully more as we grow.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Well, you've been involved anyway with bringing quite a few products to market, and one of the things you're very good at is doing so quickly. Do you have any kind of like prized strategies or favorite processes or tricks? Maybe tricks isn't the right word for it, but tools that you use to go to market quickly, really accelerate that time frame?
Yeah, and you make me think of, once in a while a client will come in and I want to hire you, you're senior guys, and you should be able to get this done quickly. And we tend to redirect that conversation that, if we're good, it's good because we do things well, or we do things right or appropriately, not because we do things any more quickly. There's a what's the word I'm looking for? Induction. So in electrical engineering, there's the harder you push, the more resistance there is, right? There's I think in design, there's sort of a natural law of the same ilk, right? That the more people you put on it, the harder you try and push, the more resistance you're going to get. That you increase the odds of things going wrong rather than decreasing them. So, one of the things that we're fond of saying too, it's an adage, but that make the right thing and then make the thing right. I think that comes from the Agile school, and I'm still not convinced that Agile works in hardware development, but I think the adage is appropriate. So in order to save time, we actually dedicate an appropriate amount of time up front to make sure that we're super clear on the product definition. That before we get into CAD design concepts and whatever, we're taking the right amount of time to get really detailed in the product requirements doc, to have all those debates or arguments about different features, holding that up to the mental construct, right, of an MVP, a minimally viable product, and making sure everything is pointed at the appropriate user experience, and really hammering that out. And that may involve some engineering investigations, kind of first order reality checks, kind of thing.
Yeah. How do you know that you're really clear on the problem and that you have all the right requirements? What are some tools that you use to develop that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is simply kind of the collective wisdom around the table, and enough scar tissue from things having gone wrong in the past. But if we need to do some reality checks and reach out to other domain experts, or do some back of envelope calculations, or kind of do some quick layouts or XYZ stacks, and to make sure volumes are working, or whatever it is, that phase will include those kinds of activities to validate. But then it's there's a threshold of confidence where you're never going to get to that 100%. but at least you understand if there are things that are unanswered, at least you understand the questions better, and how to prioritize going into the design phase.
Yeah. What are a few of the biggest mistakes that you see engineering teams making on new product development projects?
Yeah. Well, aside from not spending enough time in definition, I think the aforementioned sketching, so getting into CAD too quickly, and committing before spending enough time kind of getting broad with concept development. And then on the flip side, getting too far in CAD before doing any kind of prototyping. So if you're kind of getting into the nitty gritty of the model in CAD and you haven't made anything yet, you're probably kidding yourself about something. So it's the prototype early and often thing. So that's kind of another mistake is you can never make too many protos. Start super coarse. There's nothing wrong with popsicle stick and paperclip prototypes, as long as it helps you visualize what's going on, is entirely the point. And then gradually build the integration and sophistication of your proto along with the concept. The CAD is the tool that enables all of that. And obviously you can do it in a lot of analytics and things. But make sure you're living in the physical world alongside.
A friend of mine who is also on this show, Joel Williams, has a phrase he calls real good versus feel good. And I think as engineers, sometimes CAD can be feel good, but not real good, right? Mm-hmm. We all love getting into CAD, but like you say, sometimes it's not the right tool, or at least not the right time in the project to use that tool. You've worked managing engineers and design teams for a long time. Have you found any effective methods of allowing engineers and designers the freedom that they need to feel creative and happy with their autonomy, but also giving them enough guidance so that they don't spend too much time going down rabbit holes that just aren't going to be fruitful?
Yeah, I think as a manager, managers, we need to just sort of start with a healthy dose of humility and understand that whatever we have going on in our heads is, probably not the most effective answer, is just one answer, and to give our teams the space to do that, hire great people and let them do their thing. So I think first, making sure the team has the tools, and the practices, support structure to operate within, and they feel safe about making prototypes that are disastrous, because you just learn more that way. And then if there is providing oversight, but in the context of making sure everyone's staying on point, staying on the objectives. So the things that come out of the definition phase, say, to use that as the touchstone and redirect to objectives if that's what needs redirection, not necessarily micromanaging the execution of the design. So what if you would have put the rib in a different place? It's, managers need to kind of get over themselves in terms of that. And then at the same time, insist on regular design reviews. Everybody needs that critical feedback. Make sure you leave space between reviews to let engineers do their thing, flex their muscles, but have those moments where you can come back and make sure that we're still on point with whatever the objective is.
Yeah, those are great answers. And I really like that you mentioned helping engineers feel safe. That's something we talk about quite a bit here at Pipeline, is making each other feel safe. And we're not talking about physical safety. We're not worried that someone's going to sucker punch us in the parking lot or anything like that, but psychological safety, right? If someone makes a mistake on the team, are we worried that other team members are going to pounce on us and say something mean or nasty? Or do we have the faith and confidence in our team members to know that if we make a mistake, others are going to gather around and support us and say, hey, don't worry about it, man. We got your back. Mm-hmm. And I think making people in general, but in this context, engineers feel safe is one of the great tools that we have as managers to facilitate that creativity and productivity.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, I'm going to take a very quick break here and share with the listeners that teampipeline.us is where you can learn more about how we help medical device and other product engineering or manufacturing teams develop turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines to characterize, inspect, assemble, manufacture, and perform verification testing on your devices. We're speaking with Arne Lang-Ree today. Arne, what are a few of your favorite tools for managing product development projects? Could be, something general like having one-on-ones with people, or it could be a specific app you use, or maybe there's some kind of machine that you love for prototyping, just anything like that. What comes to mind?
Yeah, I think we were just talking about one. I mean, in terms of the one-on-ones, staying in touch with the team, checking in with people. What are the concerns? What kind of, emotional state sounds a little woo-woo, but, where is everybody at that moment? I mean, we all have lives, right? And just keep that in mind, and creating that space for people to excel. And then having a space, or the materials, if we're encouraging people to make quickie sketch prototypes, well, then have some materials and some tools to do that kind of stuff. Even if it's the hot melt glue gun and the aforementioned popsicle sticks and foam core, or a box of Lego Technic, fantastic tool for quick mock-ups of linkages and mechanisms and everything. And you can go nuts, probably as we all did when we were kids. I think digitally, we've looked a lot, and we've not found sort of the single digital platform that works, from A to Z. And other, design firms that we've talked to, they find the same thing. Everybody kind of ends up using a few favorite apps or platforms and then patching it all together with smart sheets and, other things to make it work for them. And that's what we do as well. We've got some pretty monstrous Google Sheets and smart sheets that we've put together. They still break, but we put them back together and they work fine. Beyond that, other apps, as a design firm, we use Harvest for timesheet and expense tracking and invoicing and those nuts and bolts stuff. We use Notion for it works sort of like for us like a title page, so that for any particular initiative or project, we kind of gather everything in one place, even though it links out to other tools. And then stuff like Miro for shared whiteboards, it's a collaboration space, can be pretty effective.
That's great. I had not heard of any of those. I'm going to check them out for myself now. All right. Well, shoot, this might lead maybe as a good segue into the next question. What's one tool, and I'm using that word, kind of loosely, that doesn't exist, but if it did, would dramatically increase the speed with which engineers are able to develop new products? It can be even mythical if you want. It doesn't need to obey the laws of physics. So feel free to be, pretty out there with your answer if you want.
Yeah, I think it would be that mythical platform where it's some mashup of things like Miro. So there's some collaborative space where you can be really loose, where you're just dropping a bunch of screen captures from things you find on Google Images, or it's, mind mapping, very loose, nonlinear kind of things. But at the front end gives you a place to plan, to capture those objectives in a way that you can continue to check in with them and have a living document in there that constitutes the plan, and then sort of follows. So take like Microsoft Project. Now I don't want to rain on them, but it's an easy example. That kind of Gantt chart thinking is great for planning, right? But in my experience, and especially the bigger the project grows, you need a staff to manage Microsoft Project, to track your actual program. And sometimes the roles reverse, like you feel constrained about pivoting to get to the best design, but you're constrained by the Gantt chart. Oh my gosh, we can't break project. It tells us that we need to do these things. So something like that was way more fluid and flexible and moved through the process like we do. So I don't know, Aaron, maybe you and I should retire and build that, but
that sounds like a lot of fun. Well, that's a great answer. Let's see. Can you share one of the processes? We talked about some tools, and this is a similar question, but one of the processes that your team uses that has proven to be pretty beneficial to your customers and the projects that your team works on.
Yeah, I think it's creating some working documents, very simple stuff, to have handy for conversations with clients. So, for instance, a storyboard. I mean, we're engineers. That's supposed to be the domain of, say, industrial designers, because they know how to sketch people. But really, a storyboard is a super efficient and effective way to capture what we're designing for. It's ultimately the context, and it doesn't. For consumer product and stuff, it's about what's the user experience? What's the problem for this person that you're trying to solve? How does the product work into their life? And it can just be a super simple stick figure kind of thing. And then the other is sort of the Gen 2 list, if you will, that as feature ideas come up, or feature ideas that already exist for the product, but you need to peel them away as you're distilling what is the first product, say, of this company out the door. Keep a list somewhere of all these things as a repository for stuff that you can use for the next gen product. And it gives clients a place to put it mentally. Like, we're not just saying, no, we can't use that idea. We're saying, ooh, great idea. Let's put it on the Gen 2 list so we can stick to your go-to-market strategy. We won't delay this program because that's going to take some time to develop or whatever. And it really helps keep the conversation fluid and keep the relationship really collaborative. Sounds simple, but it makes a big difference.
So this storyboard that you're talking about, is this like kind of like what you would see? I don't know if there was a documentary about how a movie was made. You've got like little cells in which there are pictures depicting, one scene of events and then the next and then the next. How does that apply to a product being developed?
Yeah, no, it is. It's exactly like that. The objective for everything that we do, whether it's a consumer product or a bridge or a new engine technology for a boat. I mean, who knows? Engineers do a lot of different things, but what we're doing fits into some larger story, and keeping that really front of mind. What it is that we're trying to solve for. What is that ultimate objective? What's the problem that somebody in their life out in the world, or lots of people, have that will be made better by what we're doing? And that's the story that we're working inside of. So the simplest way to think about it is to kind of reel back to high school English. And if you remember that curve, there's the flat part in the front, that's exposition, and then there's a bend in the curve, that's the conflict, and then the rising action, the resolution. Those four elements, you can save the denouement stuff. It's not as critical, but the exposition, like, who is this client? Who is this user? What's their world like? Are there competitors that we have to think about? Are there cost constraints? What's all that context that informs the design. And then the conflict is, you know, my boat uses too much fuel or whatever it is. You know, we need better technology. It pollutes the ocean. Then the action part, well, that's you doing the design. So all the little problems that you got to solve along the way, all pointed at the resolution. And then so imagine what that is. Like, what's the story look like when you're done? You know, and keeping that front of mind, and that we're all working inside this larger narrative, really keeps everybody on the same page.
I love that. I don't think I've heard it described in that way before. You know, of course, we use project requirements documents and you know, FEMAs and things like that to kind of define the necessities of the project and assess risk and things like that. But I've never heard about it talked about like that in story form, putting the whole thing into like a narrative, as you put it. That sounds really interesting. Now, do you literally like pictorially visualize these things, or is it just, you know, lists of different bulleted lists, or a mix of all of these things?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be stick figures, you know, because sometimes that's just not appropriate. You know, like I said, engineering is a very broad field. But you could put together a flow chart that's in more or less story form.
Okay.
Like, here are all the inputs. Here's everything that needs to get considered. And here's where the whole thing falls apart, where it's broken. And how do we rebuild, remap that flow chart to get us to the endpoint that we're looking for?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. All right, just a few more questions, and then I think we'll wrap things up. If you could put a short phrase on a billboard that would be seen by every engineer on the planet, what would it say?
Well, now you got me all into narrative. So I'd say, know the story.
Know the story.
It's simple as that, you know, and whether it's the user, your client, all the various stakeholders that are going to somehow interact with your project, you know, and lock on to those objectives. So yeah, know the story.
That's great. All right. This next question is, I think it's kind of an unusual question to have for a podcast about being an engineer, but I really love it because it just helps us get to know the guest, I think, on maybe a more personal level. So the question is, what's the most scared you've ever been? And you can take that from, you know, personal standpoint, professional standpoint, however you want it. What's the most scared you've ever been, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah. Well, what did I learn from it? I'll put first is just being quite a bit more fearless. You know, there's a popular bumper sticker, you know, no fear, I think is a brand. And has everything to do with launching Spanner and how we, how my business partner and I move with Spanner. We're constantly checking each other on if what something is fear-based or not, you know, like, don't live in the fear. There's nothing to be afraid of. It's just, you know, that's a brainstem reaction. But the biggest, most fearful thing that sort of reset all of that for me in a big way was back in 99. Our oldest child, who was just shy of 4 years old, was diagnosed with cancer.
Oh my goodness.
And to like hear that from the pediatrician, I mean, that sense of just everything caving in, you know, the whole world just kind of collapses. You know, it's just absolutely terrifying. And I think, I don't know, I'm just speculating, but maybe more so as a parent than if it were my own diagnosis.
Yeah.
There's just so much more wrapped up in it. Cut to the chase, she's absolutely great. She did fabulously. It was a grueling and hellacious experience, but she's gone on to do great things.
Oh, thank goodness! Wow.
Yeah, but you know, it is a learning experience. You know, I've heard other people say this about experiences like that. Like, if you could go back, would you trade it? And obviously, knowing that the outcome was positive, it's easy for me to say, no, I wouldn't trade that. I learned a lot. I know plenty of other families who would disagree, if the outcome is different. But for me, it's just, it reset a lot of things, changes perspectives.
Thank you for sharing such a personal story. First off, that's amazing, and so happy to hear everything turned out well. It made me think of my answer for this, which is in the same ballpark, maybe not so severe as yours, but our son had a seizure one night when we were out at a restaurant, and it had never happened before, so this was out of the blue for us. And
terrifying.
Yeah, the seizure itself was bad enough, but it occurred when he was eating something, and he was just a year old, so he didn't, he couldn't tell us what was happening. And all of a sudden he started turning blue, and then he was out, and the paramedics came and got him to the hospital. Luckily, in our case as well, everything turned out fine. He's great now. But I think, when you're talking about what's the most scared you've ever been, anything that happens to your kids, that's a prime candidate right there for sure. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, we'll end with maybe a less serious question here, maybe a little lighter note. What has been one of the most interesting or fulfilling product design projects that you've worked on?
Yeah. I've been asked that before, and it's tough because there's so many that are like our babies that, and for different reasons that were interesting. So if I expand but keep it short on a couple or three, there's one, and I think they're all on our website portfolio section, but you can go look them up. But there's a startup called Sana, with an amazing backstory. The founder, just out of his own experience and literally near death experience, to deal with chronic pain through simply helping people sleep, and discovered that you can kind of trick your brain into going to sleep by distracting the front half, the overthinker part of your brain, with just simple light and tones in your ears and in your eyes. So it's just this mask. It looks like an Oculus kind of, not as bulky, but very simple light and sound. No pharmaceuticals required, and he can put you to sleep in 15 minutes. There's another product from another startup, and it was a single founder. Oh, actually, it was a partnership. These two women, called EMME, that changing a user's relationship to birth control pills. So it's a smart pill dispenser, but not dispenser really, just a case. And then coupled with a really well executed and brilliant sort of back end in the app, but communicating with user via text. So it stays super discreet. It just looks like you're texting your best friend, but
interesting.
You might be texting for some advice. And so, it was just building some smarts into the case to recognize a few things during just during the use patterns. And the last one, again, a startup, it's a Brava oven. That's, if you like to cook, you got to check it out. It's a super cool product. It just looks like about the same scale as a largish microwave, but it cooks with high intensity light. The same like light elements that they use in the wafer fabrication industry. There has to be triple redundancy safety to turn the lights off if you're trying to open the door, because you could burn your retina, kind of thing. But the smarts that are built into it and the AI that they developed is really amazing. You can have your asparagus, your salmon fillet, and your potatoes all in the same tray, and it'll cook all three like perfectly in the same amount of time at the same time.
Wow. Is that because the light is directed in different ways?
Well, it has three
targeted
zones. Okay. Yeah, it has three zones, and they are fairly directional. but there's a camera, and they've trained the AI to recognize,
I see. Okay.
how do you tell whether food is approaching the right state and when to
Neat.
go hotter, cooler, whatever.
Very cool. When you were talking about the sleep mask, I was thinking to myself that over the years I have noticed that when I'm trying to fall asleep, there's a little trick that I'll do, and it's to count backwards from 999, but it's not just counting. I visualize the numbers, and something about visualizing the numbers specifically tricks my brain to stop fretting about whatever's going on, right? Whatever happened that day, what I have to do tomorrow. And it focuses on the numbers. And for me, that's worked really well. But it's not just counting. I have to visualize the numbers or it doesn't work. I wonder if it's a similar principle as this sleep mask that your team developed.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it could be. 'Cause, your frontal cortex is trying to make sense of everything that's all the input.
Yeah.
So like with the lights and the sound, there's no pattern to it that it is recognizable, and so it's desperately trying to create one where there isn't, and so it gets distracted. And like you're saying, if it's working to visualize these numbers, it has a task.
Yeah.
Then the rest of your brain can kind of sneak up on it,
Yeah.
usurp control.
Exactly. Okay. Well, very cool. Arne, what a delight this has been speaking with you. You're just a fountain of wisdom and knowledge in the engineering space. Thank you for sharing your time. Is there anything else that you think we should talk about that we haven't hit on yet?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you and I get to go on talking about design all afternoon, so I think we could leave it at that.
All right. Sounds good. Well, Arne, thank you again. I really appreciate you being with me today.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Aaron.
I'm Aaron Monker, founder of Pipeline Design and Engineering. If you liked what you heard today, please share the episode. To learn how your team can leverage our team's expertise developing turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines, and with product design, visit us at teampipeline.us. Thanks for listening.